Channel 93 seconds, one folder. And the moment Melania Trump's smile shattered. In a ballroom bathed in soft gold, the former First Lady stood beneath chandeliers, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. For years she had mastered the art of silence, of enduring, of observing without breaking. But that night in front of over 12 million viewers, something cracked. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice. She simply laid a manila folder on the podium, calm, deliberate, devastating. The room, once filled with polite applause, fell into a silence so thick it seemed to press on every chest. And then the camera caught it. Melania's hands tightened. Her shoulders rose just slightly. Her smile vanished. Her eyes, wet with something unspoken, met AOC's. For 93 seconds, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. This story is fictional, but the emotions it explores are not. Behind every crafted image lies a truth we rarely see: the weight of silence, the price of power, and the cost of finally speaking up. So we ask you, what would make a woman who's seen everything finally tremble? It was the kind of hearing that pulled every camera in Washington. Rows of suited officials lined the mahogany benches, their faces a mask of authority, but underneath tension crackled like static in the air. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat poised at the center of it, all eyes locked on the witness across from her, a retired intelligence officer known for saying little and meaning even less. C-SPAN rolled. Flashbulbs blinked. Somewhere outside the chamber, a storm gathered. AOC was mid-sentence grilling the man on inconsistencies in a border security report when a shadow appeared at her side. A young staffer, pale and hesitant, bent low and whispered just three words: "It's from Langley." The envelope slid under her notes, discreet but deliberate. Cream-colored, unmarked, except for a black stamp that read, "Eyes Only." Her hand hovered over it for a beat too long. She kept speaking, her voice steady, but something in her gaze changed. She broke the seal with a practiced thumb. Inside were 3 sheets of government bond paper, half of the content redacted in thick black lines. But the title pierced through like a bullet to glass: Midnight Briefings. FLOTUS Access, Fort El Paso. For a fraction of a second, AOC froze. The hearing room didn't notice. Not yet, but the staffers behind her did. One leaned forward with a tight brow. Another suddenly silenced a vibrating phone, their thumb fumbling as if it had gone cold. A third began typing something furiously into an encrypted app. And then it spread. Like a whisper too sharp to ignore, phones buzzed in synchronized rhythm. Reporters in the gallery exchanged sidelong glances. One of the aides for the chair leaned in toward a colleague and mouthed, "Did you see that title?" AOC slowly lifted her eyes from the document. Her voice now had a slight tremble, not of fear, but of realization. The kind of realization that doesn't just shift a hearing, it shifts the floor beneath it. The man across from her, the witness, must have sensed it. He squinted. "Is there something you'd like to add to the record, Congresswoman?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slid the papers back into the envelope and whispered to her own aide, "We need to verify this." Quietly. The buzz around the chamber grew louder, then quieter. People were still speaking, still presenting evidence, but no one was really listening anymore. Everyone was watching her, and something was wrong, very wrong. Fort El Paso was supposed to be a decommissioned facility. Why would the First Lady have access to it? And why in midnight briefings, and more urgently, why was this being handed to her now in the middle of a national hearing? She glanced again at the black bar of redactions, the hollow space where truth had been buried. But even silence leaves fingerprints. And these pages had weight. They didn't just suggest a secret. They promised one, a dangerous one. AOC took a breath. Not the kind you take when you're uncertain. The kind you take when you know something's about to change and there's no turning back. The chairman banged his gavel, calling for recess. Cameras clicked. Voices rose. But she remained seated, the envelope clenched in her hand. And somewhere beneath the noise, a whisper echoed again. Why was Melania Trump receiving classified briefings in a military base that doesn't officially exist anymore? And better yet, who else knew? The flicker of fluorescent lights broke through the desert, dark like a blade against velvet. Midnight in El Paso wasn't supposed to feel cinematic, but that night it did. Security cameras, black and white, low frame rate, caught the image first. A long black SUV crept past a checkpoint, that officially no longer existed. The guard didn't salute. He looked the other way. Inside the vehicle sat a woman cloaked in silence and shadows. No entourage, no press, not even a Secret Service detail. Just her, Melania Trump. Her signature coat, dark, minimal, almost military, folded sharply as she stepped out onto the cracked tarmac of Fort El Paso. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Two men in desert fatigues waited for her at the edge of the landing strip. One held a clipboard. The other had no name tag, no visible rank, just a slight limp and a gaze that didn't blink enough. He stepped forward, whispered something, and gestured toward the old infirmary building in the distance. There were no lights on inside, no sound. But the door was already open. And inside, waiting behind layers of retrofitted steel, was a name that hadn't appeared in public records for over 7 years: Colonel Renner. Presumed dead, listed as MIA after a covert operation in Honduras. Classified. His face was gaunter, now more weathered but unmistakable. And the way he stood, half-shadowed, half-stiff, gave away something else. This wasn't the first time Melania had come here. And whatever they were discussing, it wasn't about fashion protocol or public image. It was about access to something or someone off the books. And as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez flipped through the accompanying dossier in her office later that night, the puzzle pieces began to shift in her mind. Not click into place, no, it was far too early for that. But something moved. Colonel Renner, Fort El Paso, a decommissioned facility hosting midnight meetings with a first lady off camera, off record, off grid. AOC's brow furrowed, her eyes darting between timelines, redacted signatures and notations scrawled in shaky black pen. The photos were grainy, taken from long distance. But there she was, Melania, always alone, always at night, and always walking toward that same sealed building. She'd seen classified folders like this before. In her first year, when she stumbled onto the border resolution files, during the hearings on migrant child detainments, in that single awful moment when she learned entire swaths of oversight were deliberately erased from the system. But this felt different. This felt personal. Her fingers traced the edge of the final photo. The timestamp was a year before the Capitol riot. And the man standing next to Melania in that shot, the one just barely turned away from the camera, bore a striking resemblance to someone she had crossed paths with before. Not in Congress, but in a Pentagon hallway. A man who vanished right before a subcommittee hearing on cyber surveillance? Could this all be connected? She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly. No shock in her expression. Not even outrage. Just something quieter, heavier. The weight of knowing that beneath every stage in Washington lies a trap door, and sometimes the people pulling strings behind the curtain aren't politicians. They're the ones no one ever votes for or sees. She whispered to herself, half in thought, half in warning. Melania wasn't just visiting a base. She was being briefed. But briefed on what and why now? The clock ticked past 1:47 a.m., and outside her window, DC slept in deceptive silence. AOC's eyes didn't blink. Her mind didn't rest. Because this wasn't a story about the past anymore. It had just become about the present. It began like all modern storms do, quietly, then all at once. At 6:04 a.m., a Twitter account known only for decoding military air traffic posted a blurry satellite image. Fort El Paso. A timestamp. The faint silhouette of an SUV parked near a locked wing of the base. The post got 14 retweets. By 6:17, a second post followed. Why was Melania Trump there? Why no press? Why no log? This time the number jumped first, hundreds, then thousands. A flood of armchair sleuths, amateur historians, and political junkies smelled blood. Within 90 minutes, the hashtags had formed like thunderheads above a sleeping capital during our midnight Melania. AOC leaks. Kaflotus files. Then came the screenshots. Someone had leaked 3 redacted pages. Enough to see the title, Midnight Briefings, FLOTUS Access. Enough to see AOC's initials in the upper right corner. Enough to stir panic, fascination, and conspiracy in equal measure. By 9:00 a.m., major outlets were circling. CNN framed it as a breach. Fox called it a political stunt. MSNBC asked who else knew. But AOC, she said nothing. Not to the press. Not to the cameras waiting outside her office. Not to the network producers blowing up her staffers' phones. Not even to the committee chair who left her 3 increasingly urgent voicemails. Instead, she sat silently in room 242 of the Rayburn building, her fingers resting lightly on the same envelope that had started all of this. Her team urged her to respond. Say something, anything, even if it's just no comment. But she didn't flinch, because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about gravity and consequence and the cost of looking away. Across the country, reactions fractured like cracked glass. Some saw it as proof of a shadow government. Others believed it was a distraction from something larger. But millions couldn't stop asking the same question. Why was Melania Trump receiving classified briefings at a decommissioned military site, alone off record, without oversight? The mystery took on a life of its own. Its TikTok creators reenacted the SUV scene with dramatic filters and ominous music. Instagram pages posted side-by-side comparisons of Melania's outfits, trying to match the leaked photo with her public wardrobe. Reddit threads exploded with theories ranging from arms deals to asylum negotiations to the resurrection of Cold War-era psyops. And still AOC said nothing, until the C-SPAN cameras caught her in a hallway late that afternoon. The lighting was harsh. Her hair was pulled back. No makeup. No prepped statement. Just her walking briskly through marble corridors, a folder clutched to her side like a lifeline. Then just for a moment she slowed. A reporter shouted her name. Another asked, "Congresswoman, can you confirm the documents are real?" She didn't break stride, but the boom mic caught it. A whisper, not defiance, not outrage. Just a sentence that cracked open the moment we weren't supposed to see this. Now we can't unsee it. Then she turned the corner and was gone. That whisper traveled faster than any press conference ever could. It was clipped, subtitled, memed, projected. By midnight, it had reached over 40 million views. Because it wasn't a soundbite, it was a sentence millions felt in their bones. By the next morning, 12 members of Congress had issued statements. 4 called for an investigation. 2 demanded AOC recuse herself. One anonymous source at the Pentagon told The Atlantic, "If those files are real, someone committed treason. But I'm not sure it was her." The country didn't erupt. Not yet. But it leaned forward, held its breath, and waited for the next page to turn. The walls of her office didn't feel safe anymore. They felt like paper, thin, fragile, unable to contain the roar building inside her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood by the window looking out at the Capitol dome, half-lit by the gray wash of a D.C. morning. The city was already stirring sirens in the distant news choppers overhead, and a line of reporters forming like vultures outside the Rayburn building. Somewhere inside her purse, her phone buzzed for the 8th time in 2 minutes. She didn't check it. Instead, she stared at her own reflection in the glass. Is this revenge, or is it justice? The question haunted her like a thread pulling loose from a tightly woven fabric. She didn't like how it made her feel, because the truth was she didn't know. Not fully. She hadn't asked for the envelope. She hadn't leaked the contents. But she hadn't buried it either. And now, the country was watching. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back not to Melania or Fort El Paso, but to a woman named Donna Morales, a whistleblower, a quiet bureaucrat who came to her office in 2019 with trembling hands and a locked file full of data manipulation inside a federal housing program. AOC had believed her. She had even promised to protect her, but the committee shut the case down in less than a month. The subpoenas never came, the headlines never ran, and Dana lost her clearance. Lost her pension, lost her voice. AOC had called her months later, apologized, but Dana had said something that never left her. Truth doesn't care about your comfort, Congresswoman. It only asks for courage. And now, standing at this crossroads, those words came back with full force. She reached for the folder on her desk, the redacted documents, the ones that made no sense and yet explained too much. She turned to the first page again, eyes scanning the blacked-out lines, her mind replaying that whisper in the hallway. We weren't supposed to see this. Now we can't unsee it. It would be so easy to let it go, to let the system digest it, delay it, spin it. She could say she was misquoted, say she had nothing more to add, let the chaos burn out. But easy had a cost, and silence had consequences. Melania Trump's midnight visit to a lockdown military base wasn't a tabloid headline. It wasn't about fashion or gossip. It was about something deeper, something that reeked of unauthorized access, buried briefings, and power moving in the shadows. Still, the voices around her offered doubt. A senior aide had urged her to slow down. This could backfire. You're walking into a narrative trap, he'd warned. They'll make it about you. But that wasn't the fear. The real fear. That if she didn't move now, if she didn't speak, the truth would vanish like it always did, buried under noise, eaten by fatigue, and someone somewhere would be left alone in the silence. Again. She looked up from the folder and caught her own reflection once more. This time she didn't see doubt. She saw fire, resolute, measured, rising. She whispered to the room, not for cameras, not for staffers, but for herself. This isn't about revenge. It's about refusing to look away. Then she picked up the folder and walked toward the door. Outside, the world was waiting, and this time she would not be quiet. The cameras clicked like insects in the bright hallway of St. Agnes Children's Hospital. Melania Trump walked slowly, her heels silent on the polished floor, her tailored cream coat hanging perfectly over her shoulders. Children lined the corridor, holding handmade cards. Nurses stood respectfully to the side. One child, a boy with thin arms and tired eyes, handed her a stuffed bear. She smiled. It was soft, practiced, almost radiant. The kind of smile she had worn through state dinners and press tours during hurricane visits and holiday speeches. But today, as she leaned forward to accept the gift, her hands trembled. Not much, barely enough for the cameras to notice, but it was there, unmistakable. A flicker in the hand that had once signed books titled, "Be Best." The media would run their blurbs, Flotus brightened spirits at Children's Hospital. They'd note her grace, her elegance, her stoic charm. But they wouldn't mention how, when the cameras cut away and the children returned to their rooms, she asked to be left alone. Not with staff, not with her Secret Service detail, just alone. She stepped into the hospital's small chapel, unused this time of day. Light poured in through narrow stained glass windows, a deep amber glow that made the silence feel warm, almost forgiving. She sat down in the second row. From her purse, she pulled out a worn envelope. Inside were folded pages, aged and creased at the corners. Letters from her father, letters she hadn't read in years, written back when she still used the name Kanavs. The Slovenian script was hard for others to understand, but she'd memorized the rhythms. Dignity is what you hold when no one holds you. You will walk through dark rooms, my daughter, but walk proud. Walk quiet. Let the walls know your name. She used to believe that. She used to think that silence was its own kind of strength. But lately, silence felt different, heavier, lonelier. She glanced at her phone screen, lit with dozens of missed calls, alerts, and headlines she didn't need to read. She'd already seen the hashtags, already heard the phrase whispered behind closed doors, "Midnight Melania." The documents, the fort, the strange leak, and that Congresswoman AOC looking directly into the camera with something far more dangerous than outrage. Conviction, the kind that didn't burn out. Melania exhaled quietly. The pages in her lap crinkled as she folded them back into the envelope and slid it into her purse. What frightened her most wasn't the media frenzy or the whispers in the White House corridors. It was the feeling she couldn't shake that someone somewhere knew what she had seen, where she had gone, and perhaps even why. The truth was, Melania hadn't asked to be part of any secret. She hadn't wanted the access. She'd only followed a voice she trusted, one that said there were children in danger files, locked away, people forgotten. She hadn't expected the metal doors, the redacted names, the face of Colonel Renner staring back at her from a photo marked MIA but stamped with yesterday's date. And now, as the chapel settled into silence again, Melania turned off her phone. Not on mute. Off. She didn't need more noise. What she needed was stillness. Because in that stillness, maybe she could remember who she had been before the gowns, before the scandals, before the midnight corridors. A daughter, a woman, a quiet witness to something no one wanted to believe. And in that quiet, for the first time in weeks, she let herself weep. By morning, the storm had a name. Not a hurricane, but it might as well have been. Shunachurdi Midnight Melania trended at #1 across every major platform, from Twitter to TikTok to the late-night monologues. Major news outlets scrambled for control. The leaks had outpaced them. CNN dropped the first bombshell photo, grainy but unmistakable Melania Trump standing beside a man identified as Colonel Samuel Renner, long presumed MIA, classified in black ink files sealed for over a decade. They were outdoors. The photo was captured at dusk, the light soft, almost gentle, casting long shadows against the chain-link fencing of what appeared to be Fort El Paso's South Quadrant. Melania wore a cream coat. Renner, aged beard unkempt, but alert, had one hand on her shoulder. The other gestured towards something beyond the frame. CNN didn't explain how they got the photo. They didn't need to. Fox News immediately denounced it as fabricated, citing inconsistencies in shadow placement and metadata timestamps. A political smear, nothing more, one host claimed. Liberals conjuring ghosts to distract from real border issues. But the American public wasn't waiting for fact-checkers. Facebook flooded with split-screen comparisons. Melania at the hospital, eyes tired and distant, juxtaposed with the leaked photo, her hand clutched tightly around something not visible. Reddit threads exploded with speculation. Was the photo recent or staged? Was Renner alive? Or had someone doctored history? TikTok creators reenacted the scene, dramatized it, questioned it. In the span of hours, Melania Trump became something she had never been before: a national cipher. To some, she was a heroine in hiding, a woman caught in machinery, too big, punished for a quiet act of courage. To others, she was complicit, a privileged insider playing victim only when the lights turned harsh. And to the cynics, she was neither. Just another pawn, one who knew more than she let on and said less than she should. Meanwhile, AOC said nothing, not a single word. Not to press, not on social media, not even a side eye in the hallway when the cameras waited for a soundbite. But that silence roared. Every news cycle turned the volume up. Where is AOC? Is she protecting Melania? Was she threatened? Is this bigger than anyone imagined? Every second of her stillness became a screen-captured moment. One particular clip, AOC exiting a Senate corridor flanked by aides, lips pressed into a thoughtful line, was slowed down and analyzed like the Zapruder film. "Look at her eyes," one commentator whispered. "She knows something." Inside newsrooms, editorial teams argued. Producers clashed with legal teams. Anchor scripts were rewritten at commercial break. How do you explain a conspiracy theory that's suddenly backed by pictures? How do you confront a whisper that turns into a name, into a file, into a face long thought buried? Meanwhile, viewers sat in their living rooms, their kitchens, their beds, watching something crack, not just in the narrative, but in the nation's belief about who tells the truth and who buries it. One woman on a morning call-in show put it best: "I don't know what she saw. I don't know what she did. But that photo, that woman looks like she walked out of something the rest of us aren't supposed to see." And still, AOC didn't flinch. She walked the Capitol halls in silence. Not denial, not fear, something else. Like she was waiting not for permission, but for the right moment, for when silence could no longer be enough. The clock struck 11:42 p.m. when the feed went live. Cable news graphics flickered with urgency. Breaking: AOC responds to marked midnight Melania. For days she had said nothing. No tweets, no quotes, no passing glances that might be interpreted as confirmation. Just silence and a country clawing at every second of it. But tonight that ended. Under the soft amber lights of a studio that rarely housed such fire, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat forward, eyes, steady, fingers loosely clasped on the table. Across from her, the host asked gently, "Congresswoman, why now?" She didn't pause. "I'm not here," she said calmly, to humiliate a woman. A beat passed. "I'm here to ask why she was ever in that room." The room she referred to needed no explanation. Everyone watching knew it: the classified operations wing at Fort El Paso. A place where civilian presence wasn't just rare, it was supposed to be impossible. The studio fell still. You could almost hear America holding its breath. AOC leaned slightly forward. Her voice dropped, not for drama, but for weight. "Let me be clear," she continued. "This is not a scandal about what Melania Trump wore or who she stood beside. This is about access to power, to information, to operations hidden from the American people under layers of clearance and red tape. Someone let her in. Someone kept records off the books. And someone expected us to never find out." She then held up a sheet of paper, blank to the viewer but symbolic. There are briefings, she said, files labeled FLOTUS Access with redacted timestamps. I've seen them, and every one of those meetings is missing from the public record. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. I am calling for a full audit of all unlogged civilian-military interactions over the last 10 years, not just for Melania, but for every administration. I want names. I want timestamps. I want accountability. The host tried to interrupt, asked if she believed Melania had committed a crime. AOC shook her head. I believe Melania Trump was used. Maybe knowingly, maybe not. But let's not pretend she was just visiting. That room, that time, that man standing beside her, Colonel Renner, he wasn't supposed to be alive. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere. Then she leaned in, her tone sharpening, not cruel, but surgical. Ask yourself, what else are we not supposed to see? Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the interview circulated within minutes. Hashtags evolved. Archasher AOC speaks. Butcher, what else? Is hidden. Dermachash audit the rooms. And yet, even in the storm, her final words struck deepest. I don't want revenge, she said as the camera slowly pulled back. I want sunlight, because cover-ups don't just hurt one party or another, they hurt the truth. And the longer we look away, the more we become complicit in forgetting what was stolen. Her eyes softened for just a moment. We're not just asking about Melania. We're asking about every ghost behind every closed door, and what they left behind. The screen faded to black, but the silence didn't return. Not this time. The morning had been meticulously scheduled, a 10:00 a.m. interview with NPR Hair and Makeup at 8:30, lighting checks at 9:15. Her press team waited in the green room with neatly folded briefing papers and a floral arrangement, lilies, her favorite, had been placed just off camera to soften her image. But at 9:27, a terse text message shattered the production cancel. Indefinitely, no explanation, no further contact. Melania Trump had locked herself inside her private study on the second floor of the East Palm residence, curtains, drawn phones, silenced, aides dismissed with a simple wave of her hand. The walls were lined with pale blue books she never had time to read. The only sound was the quiet hum of a standing fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her pacing. She opened her laptop. On the screen was a video from 2 years ago, an event in Palm Beach filled with donors and dignitaries. She watched herself in a champagne-colored gown gliding through the crowd, laughing beside someone who complimented her earrings. Her smile back then was wide, carefree. Tonight it looked alien. She played the clip again. This time she didn't blink. Then she paused at mid-laughter, leaned in and studied her own face, the tilt of her head, the ease in her eyes. She tried to remember what she had been laughing at, who had said what joke had lifted her like that. But nothing came. The memory had no color anymore, just the bitter outline of something lost. She slowly closed the laptop. On the desk beside her, an unopened letter lay tucked under a framed photo of her father, the last letter he had written before passing. She had read it only once months ago and hadn't been able to finish it, but tonight her fingers hovered above it again. For a moment she touched the edge, then pulled her hand back as if it burned. Instead, she reached for her phone. No calls, just drafts. She opened Instagram and stared at the empty postbox. Her thumbs hovered for minutes. Then finally words appeared. Short, cryptic, heavy. Sometimes the silence is the only place that tells the truth. She attached a photo, blurry, unfocused. A candle in a dark hallway. A door halfway open. The post went live at 10:41 p.m. It had over 38,000 likes in under 2 minutes. And then it was gone. Deleted. Without a trace. But not before the screenshots. Not before journalists grabbed it, analyzed the caption, speculated about the symbolism. Some said it was an admission. Others called it performance. But those who watched her closely knew better. This wasn't a strategy. It was a crack. The first visible one. From the outside, her life was still perfectly polished. The car still arrived on time. Her press team still fielded questions with poise. But inside that room behind the curtain, Melania Trump had folded into herself, staring at a memory she could no longer touch, and a future closing in around her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat there, silent, still, trying to remember who she was. Before the cameras, before the sealed rooms, before the name Renner became a whisper that wouldn't leave her mind. It started the way most things do in the modern era, with a screen split in half. TikTok became a digital battlefield overnight. On the left side of the screen, a stitched clip of AOC stern, composed eyes locked on the interviewer, as she said, "What else are we not supposed to see?" On the right side, a 19-year-old conservative influencer with a backwards cap and a $1,000 mic. This is just another radical leftist targeting a woman because she married a Trump, he declared, shaking his head. His comment section surged with flame emojis, American flags, and hashtags like Kebwine, back off Melania, and protect our first ladies. But scroll down just a little further, and the algorithm painted a different picture. Young veterans, whistleblowers, former Hill interns, all posting videos in dimly lit bedrooms, saying softly into their phones, "She's right. There are rooms we never speak of. This isn't about Melania. This is about who was allowed to be where and why." AOC Brave began trending not long after. So did Mananani. What did she see? It didn't take long before real bodies followed digital sentiment. By Friday afternoon, the sidewalks around Capitol Hill were a boiling point. One side carried signs that read, "Truth over power," and "Civilianize military secrets." The other waved American flags and held up placards that simply said, "Leave her alone." Chants clashed in midair. Police formed barricades not out of threat, but out of anticipation. Inside her temporary office, AOC watched the live streams without blinking. The volume was off. The captions auto-scrolled beneath the screens like whispers she didn't want to hear. For the first time in days, she felt the weight of what she had pulled into the light. This was bigger than an audit, bigger than even Melania. It was a referendum on silence and what it costs. And then, it happened. At exactly 3:07 p.m., Melania Trump reappeared on the public stage, not on television, not behind a podium, but through a single tweet. White background, black text. No hashtags, no punctuation, no photo. "I was never asked, I was told." 7 words, that's all. But it was enough to freeze the media cycle mid-breath. Enough to make journalists delete half-written op-eds and rewrite their angles. Enough to send Twitter's trending page into full meltdown. Within minutes, Yuri was told was stamped across feeds merch and even the lower third of cable news broadcasts. Analysts argued over its meaning. Was it consent without agency complicity under pressure? Or was it something even harder to name, something that lives in the gray space between obedience and survival? Melania said nothing more. She didn't clarify. She didn't follow up. But her silence, now sharpened by those 7 words, became its own kind of speech. At a cafe near Georgetown, a woman whispered to her friend, "Maybe she's not as protected as we thought." In a college dorm in Michigan, a student posted, "I don't know what scares me more, the fact that she went along with it, or the idea that she couldn't say no." Public opinion fractured like glass under pressure. There were no clear heroes now, only questions. AOC stayed off camera that evening, but as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome and floodlights flicked on to illuminate the protests below, it was clear America wasn't just watching anymore. It was choosing sides. And Melania's 7 words hung over them all, soft as breath, heavy as stone. The shelter hadn't changed much. Same peeling paint on the stairwell. Same faded mural of outstretched hands on the lobby wall. AOC hadn't been back in nearly a year, not since the campaign trail had swallowed her schedule whole. But tonight, after everything, it felt like the only place where the noise couldn't follow her. A staffer handed her a clipboard, but she barely glanced at it. Her eyes were already scanning the playroom. Books, crayons, the too loud cartoon on the television. A girl sat cross-legged near the window, drawing circles on the fog glass. 8, maybe 9 years old. Alone but not afraid. AOC crouched beside her. "What's your name?" The girl shrugged. "They call me B." "Hi, B," AOC said softly. "I'm Alex." B blinked. "I know. You're on my aunt's phone a lot." That made AOC smile just barely. But then B tilted her head, her voice quiet but serious. "Why do people hurt people with cameras?" The question landed like a brick dropped in still water. No warning. No way to soften the ripple. AOC swallowed. "What do you mean?" B pointed to the television, where a news ticker scrolled silently under Melania Trump's face. "My aunt said someone took a picture, and now everyone's yelling." AOC looked away. Sometimes cameras tell stories, but sometimes the people behind them forget the story belongs to someone else. B didn't nod, didn't smile, just returned to drawing her fog circles, and AOC stood up slower than she'd sat down. That night back in her apartment, the weight of B's question clung to her like smoke. She sat at her kitchen table, the lights dimmed the city outside, humming low and restless. She opened her laptop. The screen cast a soft glow on her face, emphasizing the tiredness under her eyes. No makeup, no script, just her, and the folder she had avoided opening for days. FT. El Paso, red flag list, unauthorized entry logs. Phantom transcript, C. Renner. She opened them one by one. Emails, PDF scans, snippets of surveillance reports half redacted with thick black lines. Names she didn't recognize. Times that didn't match any official record. Handwritten notes in the margins of one document said no camera entry, per FLOTUS request. That line stopped her. No camera, no documentation, no accountability. She rubbed her temples, her mind flickering back to that congressional hearing. The envelope, the documents, the weight of decision. She had wanted transparency, justice, accountability. But somewhere along the way, she wondered, had she crossed an invisible line between exposing power and violating a private life? She thought of Melania's tweet, "I was never asked, I was told." She thought of B's question, "Why do people hurt people with cameras?" And she realized neither had received a choice. She closed the files. Not deleted, just closed. But her hands lingered on the keyboard, her breath slower now. Heavy, quiet. The apartment was still. No calls, no headlines. Just the blinking cursor on her screen and a silence that stretched long enough to feel permanent. Outside, a siren passed and faded. Inside, a woman labeled by millions as hero, villain, or both, sat alone, wondering for the first time not what she had uncovered, but who she had become by doing it. The office was quiet except for the soft click of Melania's pen tapping against the legal pad. She wasn't writing, just marking time. Across from her, her lawyer spoke with the calm precision of someone who had coached dozens of public figures through far worse storms. "We deny it outright. Full stop. No comment. You were never there. The photos are doctored. You are the victim of political theater." Melania's face remained unreadable. Beside him, her aide leaned forward, fingers clasped in a gentle plea. "We can soften the narrative. A children's charity visit. A reminder of your grace. We draft a statement by noon, something empathetic but vague. And we can schedule an exclusive with Vogue. They owe you after the last cover fiasco." Melania didn't speak. Instead, she reached for her phone, scrolled slowly, and pulled up a weather app. "El Paso," she murmured. Both the lawyer and the aide froze. The aide blinked. "I'm sorry," she looked up. "What is the weather in El Paso?" "Melania, that's not the direction we recommend," the lawyer began, voice clipped now. "I know," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'm not asking for direction." And just like that, the meeting was over. By evening, her name was trending again, but not because of any press release. A single tail number had been tracked by an online aviation group. A private jet departing D.C. filed for El Paso unaccompanied. The manifest listed only one passenger, M. Trump. No cameras, no Secret Service detail beyond minimum requirement. No advisors, no glam team. Just a woman in an off-white coat stepping down onto a wind-whipped tarmac, clutching a small bag and wearing sunglasses that didn't quite hide the tension behind her eyes. At Fort El Paso, access was tight. She presented a badge with quiet familiarity. The guards exchanged a glance but didn't stop her. They'd seen her before, not often, but enough to know this was not a casual visit. She walked past the decommissioned tank at the gate, past the faded welcome sign with its chipped paint, past the chapel. Then she stopped. The chapel hadn't changed. Whitewashed walls, a single rusted bell above the door, and inside pews lined up like silent witnesses. She opened the heavy door herself. It creaked on its hinges, and for a moment she stood in the threshold, like someone returning to a memory that had never quite faded. No one else was inside. She stepped forward, heels quiet against the worn stone floor. At the front, a line of candles flickered, some new, some melted down to stubs. She chose one, lit it, watched the flame take, And then without ceremony, without camera, without witness, she sat in the third pew, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. A few minutes passed before she spoke, barely above a whisper. He protected me. The words weren't meant for anyone. Not the press, not even the man they referred to. But in them, there was no spin, no crafted line, no positioning, just a truth she had carried in silence for too long. She stayed there longer than expected. Outside, the wind picked up again, swirling desert dust around the chapel steps. Inside Melania, Trump, once the most photographed woman in the world, sat invisible. Not hidden, not exiled, but finally unseen by design. And for the first time in weeks, she did not tremble. A soft ping broke the silence of the Congresswoman's apartment. The email subject was simple: El Paso, chapel. Attached were 3 photographs. No watermark, no commentary, just still frames. AOC sat back on her couch, robe wrapped tight around her, the city humming low beyond the balcony glass. She clicked. The first image: Melania stepping out of a nondescript car, head down, alone. No entourage, no umbrella despite the wind. Her coat pressed against her frame like armor that had learned how to be quiet. The second, the white chapel door slightly ajar. Her silhouette paused in the doorway. 1 foot forward, 1 foot still outside. Suspended, caught between intention and memory. The third, a candle, newly lit, centered in a row of otherwise dying flames. No one knew who had taken the photos. Maybe someone inside the base. Maybe a soldier who didn't think of it as surveillance, just observation. But to AOC, they didn't feel like political ammunition. They felt like something older, quieter, sacred almost. She stared at them for a long time, then closed her laptop. This wasn't what she'd expected. Not from Melania. Not from the woman whose silence had once felt complicit, whose grace had seemed rehearsed, whose smile had too often stood next to power and yet never truly spoke against it. But here in these unguarded images, something flickered. Not confession, not surrender, but humanity. AOC leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands folded like she used to sit during student protests. Not in command, in contemplation. She thought of the whisper she'd spoken days ago, half to herself, half to whatever God lived inside a news camera. We weren't supposed to see this. Now we can't unsee it. Back then it had felt like a battle cry. Now it felt more like an ache. Because the scandal wasn't the woman in the photo. It wasn't even the military base. It was the decades of silences, of buried names and vanished reports. It was the system that swallowed truth so efficiently that no one bothered to ask why anymore, only who leaked it. She picked up her phone, flipped through her notes app. Not to write a statement. Not yet. Just to reread something she had saved months earlier from a speech she never gave. Truth is not fire. It does not burn down what you hate on your behalf. Truth is weight, and some of us carry it until we break. Others carry it until we understand. She closed the app, looked again at the final image of the candle, and for the first time in weeks, she let go of judgment. Not because Melania deserved it, not because the headlines were wrong, but because she suddenly understood some truths don't need to be shouted to be felt. Some truths whisper in empty chapels and linger in the flicker of a flame. Later that evening, when a reporter called to ask for comment, "Have you seen the photos of the First Lady at Fort El Paso?" AOC simply replied, "I've seen them, and I think we all carry weight differently." That night, she didn't reread more emails, didn't call her staff. She stepped onto the balcony, let the air bite her skin, and stared out at the Manhattan skyline, not as a congresswoman, not as an investigator, but as a woman watching another woman try to be something more than the sum of her silences. For a moment, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about sides. It was just 2 women walking different roads that somehow, somewhere ran in parallel. The podcast dropped at 7:03 a.m. No teaser, no fanfare. Just a plain thumbnail renner, unfiltered. By 7:45, it had 2 million downloads. The voice that greeted the nation wasn't theatrical. No dramatic pause, no political polish. Just a man speaking like he had nothing left to protect except the truth. There were meetings, yes, after hours, unofficial. Midnight wasn't a code word, it was the time on the clock. Silence on the line. Then the host asked what everyone had waited weeks to know. Was she there? Renner breathed the kind of breath that sounds heavier than confession. Yes. Melania was there. Social media froze. Timelines stalled mid-scroll. The silence was so loud it felt like the country was holding its breath through earbuds. Renner continued. She came not as a first lady, not with cameras, no staff, no press team, just her. She said she needed to see the truth with her own eyes. And she did. The host pressed gently, carefully now. And what did she ask of you? There was a pause just long enough to make the world lean in. She didn't ask me to lie, Renner said. She asked me to listen. He went on to explain the setting, a small concrete room at Fort El Paso. One overhead light, a map of the detention layout still pinned to the wall curling at the corners. She didn't sit right away. She paced. She brought a list of names, dozens of them, handwritten, not typed. Some of them were children. Some had no last names. She said, these are the ones they don't let you see on the press tours. He described how she read them aloud, one by one, some names so softly it felt like prayer. Then she looked at him and said, I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to make sure they're not forgotten. By the time the episode reached the 40-minute mark, CNN had broken into programming. Fox ran a split-screen Renner's voice on one side, Melania's chapel photo on the other. AOC had not responded yet. Her team issued only a one-line statement, "We are listening." Meanwhile, the internet fractured. Some called Renner a hero, others called him a traitor, but no one could ignore what he said next. The base was under orders. No logs of those meetings were to be created. We were told this was off the books, but I kept notes anyway, because history doesn't forgive lost records. He promised to release the notes, redacted names for safety, but everything else unfiltered. This isn't about who she was married to, he concluded. This is about what she did when no one was watching, or so she thought. By midday, the White House refused comment. Press Secretary Jane McAllister offered a deflection. We don't engage with private media speculation, but speculation had already become something heavier. On TikTok, someone paired Renner's words. She didn't ask me to lie. She asked me to listen with footage of Melania lighting that chapel candle. It went viral within the hour, and for once the comments weren't venom or mockery. They were quiet, thoughtful, as if the nation, fractured as it was, had paused not to argue but to feel. A woman had asked for no defense. A soldier had offered one anyway. And in that unexpected alliance, something cracked, not the system, not yet, but the numbness. And across America, something long buried began to stir. They called it an emergency session, but the truth was far messier than the headline. The air in the Capitol felt thicker than usual, like history was dragging its heels through the hallways, unsure if it was about to repeat itself or be rewritten. Every seat in the House chamber was filled. The gallery overflowed with aide staffers and press, all perched on the edge of something that felt too raw for protocol. The debate over the Whistleblower Protection Expansion Act had raged for 9 hours. What had begun as a policy proposal months ago was now a litmus test for America's conscience. Footage of Colonel Renner's podcast testimony played on the monitors just outside the chamber. His words weren't played for effect. They were entered into the congressional record by unanimous consent. That almost never happened. But today, reality didn't follow the usual script. Some Republicans argued the bill was rushed. Others said it weaponized emotion. One even called it theatrical trauma politics. But when the vote began, no one dared leave the room. 218 votes needed. For 5 full minutes, the count froze at 213. The speaker's gavel hovered. Then a quiet shift, 5 unexpected votes clicked green on the screen, 3 independents and 2 moderate conservatives breaking ranks. Gasps echoed. The speaker nodded once solemnly. Bill passes. Cheers erupted. Not celebration, relief. And behind that exhaustion, the act granted immediate legal protection to all federal whistleblowers involved in the Fort El Paso timeline. It also forced a classified audit of all unrecorded civilian-military meetings from the past 10 years. The Pentagon would now answer, not obscure. AOC didn't clap. She had been standing for hours barely speaking. Her staff had offered her water. She waved them off. Now as the chamber emptied into chaos, cameras, questions, confetti, words of victory, She stepped outside alone. It was late afternoon, but the sky looked bruised, streaked with the purple gray of an almost storm. She leaned against one of the cold marble columns outside the Capitol steps and exhaled slowly, as if holding back something heavier than fatigue. A reporter tried to approach. Her aide intervened. But one mic caught what she whispered, not to the crowd, but maybe to herself. It's not justice, but it's a beginning. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't soar either. It landed like a truth that no applause could soften. Somewhere across the country, televisions played that line on loop. TikToks layered it over footage of the chamber vote. Commentators debated her tone. Was it regret, resolve, resignation? But none of that mattered to her. She had spent the past weeks clawing at doors, marked classified, dodging spin, bearing the weight of a nation's assumptions, all while asking a single question out loud. Why was she even in that room and 100 others in silence? Now, one of those questions had broken the floorboards of procedure, and that floor had creaked just enough to let in the sound of accountability. Inside the building behind her, the wheels of governance were already turning slow, grinding and reluctant. But outside on the steps, a woman stood not as a symbol, not as a politician, but as a witness who refused to look away. The wind shifted slightly. Papers rustled. Somewhere down the street, protesters sang quietly, not in anger this time, but in hope. And still she didn't move. Because beginnings are the hardest part to believe in until someone stands still enough to hold the weight of one. There were no press releases, no motorcade, no orchestrated photo ops. Just a Tuesday morning in Harlem, where the air still smelled faintly of rain, and the sidewalks buzzed with the quiet rhythm of life, children in puffy coats, racing to school, teachers ushering them through metal doors, and the occasional parent waving goodbye. No one noticed the black sedan that pulled up quietly alongside the curb. Not at first. She stepped out alone, dressed in charcoal gray hair, tied back in a style too modest for headlines. Two aides stayed behind in the car. No cameras followed. At PS 137, a small public school with peeling blue paint and a banner that read, "Books Build Brave Hearts, Melania." Trump walked through the front doors without announcement. No one quite knew what to do. The principal blinked twice before realizing who she was. A teacher whispered something under her breath. But Melania didn't pause. She walked the narrow halls with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to be anywhere. Inside a fourth-grade classroom, she sat at the back, not to speak, not to perform, just to observe. The children didn't recognize her. They were too busy drawing posters about kindness for a school-wide display. One girl offered her a crayon. She smiled, took it, and drew a small sun in the corner of the girl's paper. The child beamed. 45 minutes passed. Minutes. Then an hour. Then lunch. In the cafeteria, surrounded by the chatter of plastic trays and spilled milk cartons, she sat with a group of teachers. There was no talk of the hearings, no mention of Fort El Paso or Colonel Renner or the bill that had just shaken the nation. Instead, they spoke of literacy rates, of broken air conditioners, of students who came to school hungry but hopeful. Melania listened mostly. When she did speak, her voice was soft, without the stiff polish of politics. It sounded like a person remembering how to speak as a person, and that's when it happened. A journalist from a local nonprofit publication had been at the school to cover a story on after-school tutoring. He recognized her instantly but chose not to interrupt. Still, as Melania rose to leave, walking down the hallway toward the exit, she paused briefly near a wall lined with student art. Her eyes landed on one drawing, in particular a stick figure, standing alone under a rain cloud. The words, "Sometimes I feel forgotten," scrawled above in red marker. She stood still for several long seconds. The journalist, hanging back respectfully, overheard her murmur, something almost to herself. "Disappearing doesn't fix anything." Then she left. No statement, no comment. Just that line caught like a secret between one breath and the next. That quote didn't make the evening news, but it did land in a small write-up in the Harlem Review, buried halfway down the column. Still, someone screenshotted it. Then someone else added it to a TikTok over footage of Melania walking past the chapel weeks earlier. Within hours, it had been seen over 2 million times. Back in Washington, there was speculation. Was this her soft return? A signal, a plea? But none of that mattered to the children who had watched her draw a son. And maybe, just maybe, it didn't matter to her either. Because some appearances aren't about being seen by the world. They're about facing the part of yourself you spent years trying to vanish. The envelope arrived by courier, no official seal, no embossed signature, just a name written in thin black ink, Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her assistant handed it over mid-meeting, eyebrows raised. There was no memo inside, only a card, a time, a place, and one line written with quiet precision: on behalf of Mrs. Melania Trump, respectfully requesting your presence. It wasn't from Melania, but close enough. AOC stared at it for a full minute, saying nothing. Around her, policy advisors continued discussing legislation on whistleblower protections, unaware that her mind had drifted far from committee halls and procedural timelines. She slipped the card into her bag and excused herself. That evening, she stood outside the address listed, a small federal building tucked between two embassies in Northwest D.C. Not the White House, not Trump Tower, something quieter, the kind of place chosen for conversations no one would ever confirm. Security let her through without a word. No journalists, no aides. No one even offered to take her coat. She was led to a hallway lined with frosted windows and aging carpet. At the far end, a wooden door stood ajar. No nameplate, just the tick of a wall clock audible from inside. She paused. There was no reason to trust this. But trust wasn't the point. She stepped in. The room was unremarkable: two chairs facing each other, a small table between them, and a single clock mounted above, ticking louder than it should have. No cameras, no microphones, no one else. Melania wasn't there. Instead, her aide, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a legal pad, stood, nodded once, and left without explanation. The door clicked shut behind her. AOC stood alone for a moment, considering the room. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't absolution. It was something more difficult: an invitation to listen without posturing, to speak without cameras. Then Melania entered. No makeup, no security, no jewelry except for her wedding band and a small pendant tucked under her blouse. She looked smaller than the headlines made her, thinner, but her posture was still firm, her gaze steady. She didn't offer a handshake. Neither did AOC. They sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked. Then softly, Melania said, "This room. It's where they brought me before El Paso, before the chapel. I sat in that same chair. I was told it would be just a tour." She looked down at her hands. It wasn't. AOC didn't interrupt. Melania continued, "I didn't come to ask for sympathy or forgiveness. I know what it looks like. I know what silence costs. But I want you to know I didn't choose the lie. I was given no choice." AOC leaned forward slightly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "Why now?" Melania's eyes flicked toward the clock. "Because if I don't say it now," she whispered, "they'll write the ending for both of us." Silence. The clock ticked once, then twice. AOC nodded once. She didn't say, "I believe you." She didn't say, "I forgive you." She simply said, "So say it." In your voice, not mine. For the first time in months, Melania closed her eyes and breathed. No one else was in the room. No transcripts, no aides, no microphones. Only a silent clock ticking with the indifference of time. Two women sat across from each other, neither enemies, neither quite allies. The table between them held nothing but the space of things unsaid, and they let that space breathe. The conversation happened in a language that didn't need volume. It unfolded in glances, in silences, in the subtle choreography of discomfort, giving way to something more honest. At one point, Melania leaned forward slightly. Her hand hovered above the table, then withdrew. AOC mirrored the gesture minutes later, subconsciously, almost unwillingly. Their bodies negotiated the unspeakable long before their voices caught up. We don't hear what they said. No recordings, no recollections. Only fragments retold later by those who never stepped inside but knew something had shifted. What we do see, because someone in the hallway saw through the frosted glass, is the arc of a moment. AOC's expression softening as Melania begins to speak. The flicker of confusion turning to recognition. Melania covering her mouth at one point as if ashamed of what she just revealed. AOC unmoving, listening like the weight of the world depended on it. There is a pause longer than necessary, and then quietly a tear. Not from Melania, from AOC. It isn't dramatic. It isn't performative. Just one. And then a nod. Melania reaches into her coat and pulls out a folded paper. We don't know what's on it. A list, a confession, a map of meetings that were never supposed to happen. She doesn't hand it over. Instead, she slides it to the center of the table and waits. AOC doesn't touch it. They both look at the paper. Two women who have lived lives in rooms filled with people, but never felt more alone than now. Here they are, not roles, not institutions. Just two names history will try to pit against each other unless they choose otherwise. At the end of it all, Melania rises first. She looks older now, not from age but from the shedding of armor. She smooths her coat, brushes a strand of hair behind her ear, and finally says genuinely quietly, "Thank you for not yelling. It is not a plea. It is not sarcasm. It's gratitude from a woman who expected a war and was met with stillness." AOC stands. She doesn't smile, but her voice holds a worn grace as she replies, "Thank you for not running." They don't hug. They don't shake hands. But something between them unknots some invisible thread loosed between anger and empathy. Melania steps out first. Her aide is waiting. AOC remains behind for a minute longer, staring at the chair across from hers. Then, without picking up the paper, she exits too. When the door closes, the room looks unchanged. But it isn't. Melania didn't say anything the next morning. Not to her staff, not to the press, not to her lawyer who had been waiting for a statement draft. She only asked for a cup of black tea and a moment alone on the south-facing balcony of her townhouse in D.C. The city stirred below her like a waking animal, horns, footsteps, distant sirens. But she was still. Then at exactly 7:41 a.m., a single post appeared on her personal account. No press release, no accompanying image, no filter. Just words. Truth doesn't ask for comfort. It asks for courage. 7 words. Nothing more. No hashtags, no links, no call to action. And yet within 40 minutes, the post had spread like a pulse through the veins of the nation. Reposts flooded Instagram, screenshots overtook Twitter, and talk show panels froze mid-discussion to read it out loud. The sentence was printed in Helvetica across news banners and whispered over morning coffee in thousands of households. Some cried, some scoffed, but most paused, because it didn't sound like a statement written by a handler. It didn't even sound like an apology. It sounded like someone standing in the rain without asking for an umbrella. For once, she wasn't defending. She wasn't blaming. She wasn't running. She was naming something deeper than scandal. A human fracture, one that had begun long before the photos, long before the headlines. And America, for a breathless moment, recognized the tone. The rare courage of someone not asking to be saved, only to be understood. There were no official responses from the White House, but unofficially, a dozen aides were seen huddling in corridors, whispering questions like, "Was this pre-cleared, and does this mean she's cooperating?" No one had answers, and that perhaps was what scared them most. Across the city, in a quieter corner of Capitol Hill, AOC saw the post from her phone while sitting on a bench outside her office. She read it once, then again. She didn't react. No calls were made, no aides summoned. She simply put the phone down and stared at the marble tiles beneath her shoes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a truce, but it was something else, something harder to name. A line in the sand not drawn to divide, but to mark where the truth finally stood alone. By noon, the phrase had been projected in Times Square. By evening, a graffiti artist in Oakland had stenciled it onto a freeway underpass. In schools and churches, in whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, the words echoed, "Truth doesn't ask for comfort. It asks for courage." That night, Melania didn't check her phone again. She didn't scroll through the likes or the comments. She didn't answer calls from old acquaintances pretending to reach out in sympathy. She lit a single candle in her study, sat down, and opened a journal. Her handwriting, usually elegant, practiced, was slower tonight, less guarded. She wrote down the words again, not to remember them, but to claim them. Somewhere else in the city, a young activist reposted her words with the caption, "If this is the beginning, let's meet it brave." And America, divided as ever, did not speak in one voice, but something softer than agreement rippled underneath it all. Something like respect, something like the beginning of an ending and the start of something honest. The gymnasium smelled faintly of varnished wood and last night's rain. Rows of metal chairs creaked under the quiet weight of students, teachers, and parents, all packed shoulder to shoulder for the final round of the statewide debate tournament. On stage, a banner hung slightly crooked, Ohio Youth Civics Invitational. Speak bold, stand true. The final topic was drawn 20 minutes prior. Should public figures be held morally accountable beyond the law? Two students had already spoken, one quoting Hamilton, the other citing legal precedents from 1997. But then came a pause. From the second row, a girl in a navy skirt and pressed white shirt stood slowly. Her hand trembled as she adjusted the mic. Her name tag read Layla Chen, Westlake High. She didn't begin with a quote, didn't open with statistics. Instead, she took a breath that felt like it lasted a century and said, my mother used to tell me, what you tolerate in silence, you teach in shadow. There was a stir in the audience. Some teachers nodded instinctively. She went on. I'm not a congresswoman. I'm not a first lady. I'm 16. But I've watched the same news as all of you. I've read about children behind fences, about women caught between power and principle. I've seen truth make people uncomfortable, and I've seen silence do worse. Her voice cracked barely, but she kept going. And I've heard people say, it's complicated, it's political, it's none of our business. But if we don't hold the powerful accountable, what example do we set? The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was charged, not a whisper, not a cough. The stillness wasn't from uncertainty, it was from awe. And then, as if released by some invisible signal, the gym exploded into applause. Not polite claps, not teacher-approved decorum. Real thunderous applause. It started from the back. An old janitor in a red vest stood first, then a science teacher, then the entire second row of parents. Soon the whole room was on its feet. Layla stood frozen for a moment. She hadn't planned for that. She hadn't even known if she'd finish her paragraph. But there she was, shoulders back, heart-racing, eyes glassy. And behind the applause, something deeper moved. A realization. A shift. This wasn't just a high school competition anymore. It was a mirror. One that reflected a country grappling with questions too long postponed. Questions about power, about courage, about the cost of not asking. In the judge's booth, one moderator scribbled a note in the margin of the scorecard. Not the most polished, but the only one who told the truth. Outside the gym, the sun had finally broken through gray skies, casting long slants of light across the school's courtyard. Later that night, someone posted a shaky iPhone video of Layla's speech on TikTok. Within hours, it had 500,000 views. Not because she was famous, not because she was trending, but because the nation had been waiting, starving for a young voice to remind them that character still mattered. In a world loud with cynicism, her question rang clear. If we don't hold the powerful accountable, what example do we set? The drawer wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Some things hide better in plain sight. Weeks had passed since the last headline, since Melania had been seen stepping out of the Harlem school, a simple scarf covering her hair unnoticed by most. Her aide, cleaning out the East Wing office for the final time, moved slowly, reverently boxing things that didn't belong to history, just memory. A dried white rose, a child's drawing from 2018, a copy of Jane Eyre with folded pages and penciled notes in Slovenian. And in the bottom drawer, tucked between old stationery and a cracked leather folder, was the envelope. No stamp, no address. Just a name handwritten in narrow cursive to MT when the silence ends. The aide hesitated. She knew better, but her hands moved anyway. Inside was a single page, cream paper unlined, folded twice. The ink had faded slightly at the edges, like it had been written quickly but not carelessly. I once thought silence was grace, that restraint was dignity, that being quiet in a storm made you stronger. But I have learned silence is also permission. There were things I did not stop, words I should have challenged, walls I should have walked out from instead of walking through. I was complicit. The word lingered, alone on the line, heavier than anything else. But I also tried to be kind. I tried to speak in small ways where I thought it might still matter. A glance, a candle, a refusal to lie when I was asked to echo power. And maybe that's not enough. Maybe history will see me as a shadow, or worse, a mirror. But may history hold both truths, that I failed and that I still tried. There was more. A second paragraph, shakier now. I've watched others scream and be dismissed. I've watched the quiet be praised and forgotten. I've watched pain be politicized. I've watched children carry weight that cowards refused. Sometimes I think I was trying to protect the part of myself that was still human. And sometimes I think I was protecting no one at all. But this much I know. Then came the final line. Not just written underlined twice. Disappearing doesn't fix anything. There were no initials, no date. Just a faint smudge at the bottom of the page, perhaps, from a finger that trembled or a tear that dropped before the ink could dry. The aide folded the letter again, slid it back into its envelope. She didn't call a reporter, didn't snap a photo. She simply placed the letter in a sealed box labeled "To Archive, Personal." But word of the note would leak days later, quietly, respectfully. A whisper in D.C. circles then, a ripple across think pieces, then suddenly it was everywhere. Not as a scandal, but as something rarer, as context. The woman once dismissed as silent, aloof, ornamental, now offered a contradiction the world didn't expect. Not a confession, not a justification, just the truth in its full discomfort. That complicity and courage had lived side by side. That trying and failing weren't opposites. That even a first lady can be both wounded and awake. And that sometimes the loudest apology comes not with a podium, but from a drawer. The echo of headlines faded not abruptly, but gently like fog lifting after a storm. There were no more panels shouting across each other on primetime news, no leaked recordings, no urgent chyrons crawling across the bottom of screens. Just a Monday. Just motion. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez returned to Capitol Hill, wearing a navy coat too light for the wind. She didn't wave at the cameras. There were fewer of them now anyway. Inside the chamber, she nodded to colleagues without needing to speak. The fire in her had not dimmed, it had shifted. From explosive to steady. From pointed to purposeful. That morning, she walked past the mural of Dolores Huerta on the south wall of the committee room. A few months ago, she might have rushed past. But today, she stopped, studied it, then smiled. Not big, just enough. Across the country in New York, a woman walked through Central Park. She wore black sunglasses, but not to hide, only to see without being seen. Her pace was slow, intentional. Melania had taken this route before years ago, surrounded by bodyguards and distant eyes. Now she walked alone. A woman passed by with her toddler and did a quiet double take. She didn't say anything, didn't ask for a photo. Just smiled, then turned her attention back to her child. Melania kept walking. She paused by the Bethesda fountain, looked up at the angel in the center. She used to believe the world saw people like statues, frozen flawless, untouchable. Now she understood even stone weathers. And still it stands. From a bench nearby, a jogger took out their phone. A single photo, not shared, just kept. A moment later, Melania stood and continued toward the east exit, her coat fluttering lightly in the wind. No one followed. Back in D.C., a freshman congressman stopped AOC in the hallway. He fumbled with his notes, unsure how to say what he meant. "I just wanted to say, I think what you did mattered," he finally offered. AOC tilted her head, thoughtful. "It's not about whether it mattered," she replied quietly. "It's whether we were present." She didn't wait for a reply. Just turned and walked toward the Education and Labor Committee room, her next meeting already underway. That week, a classroom in Kansas City added a new name to their debate curriculum: accountability through empathy. Students wrote essays. One quoted Melania's last known post. Another referenced AOC's whisper on the Capitol steps. It's not justice, but it's a beginning. No one claimed the final word. But perhaps that was the point. The news cycle had moved on to trade talks, to wildfires, to celebrity weddings. But in quiet pockets across the country, something lingered. Something soft, unmarketed. A shift. Not a redemption arc, not a takedown. Just people deeply flawed, deeply human, deciding to stay. To show up. To speak with less venom, more clarity. To apologize, to admit, to continue. Because maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing is staying present when you've been hurt. The story didn't end in triumph, or punishment, or spectacle. It ended the way real things often do, not with closure, but with motion. This story reminds us that silence isn't always weakness, and presence can be more powerful than protest. In a world obsessed with noise, Melania chose quiet truth. AOC chose to stay in the room even when it hurt. Neither woman was perfect, but both made a choice to face, not flee. Their paths didn't align, but they ran parallel in courage. Sometimes accountability doesn't look like shouting. It looks like listening. It looks like showing up. And perhaps real change begins when we stop asking who's right and start asking what's honest. Question for you: have you ever chosen to stay present in a difficult moment when walking away would have been easier? Let us know in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else. If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.